What is your take on the effect that COVID-19 has had on the real estate market and the closings that you've seen so far?
The primary impact that I've seen is really on the financing side of things.
Hey everybody, it's Zen here, and on this episode of the Prime Properties podcast, I have Eric from Blackstone Law here talking about the effects that COVID-19 has had on the closings with real estate. Blackstone Law is the firm that we recommend a lot for a lot of our closings because they know what they're doing and they're really quick. Now, some of the things that we also discuss in this episode and podcast is that what happens if you can't close? Can you back out of a purchase and sale agreement because of COVID-19? What are the penalties of extending, and any kind of precautions that you should take if you are going to be transacting in the near future. Hope this will help you guys with kind of surviving the pandemic with your real estate journey, and enjoy the episode. Good day, Toronto. Welcome to the next episode of Prime Properties Podcast here. I have Eric Lee from Blackstone Law, who does a lot of the clerk work for a lot of the closings there. And we want to bring him on today just so that we have a little bit of insight as to if there's any issues revolving around COVID-19 and some of the closings that's happening in real estate. Why don't you say hi, everyone, Eric?
All right, thank you for having me, Zen. Just to preface before we get started, I'm a law student with Blackstone Law. We do a wide range of residential and commercial real estate transactions. The discussion we're aiming to have today here is not intended as legal advice. However, we do want to provide some perspective from what we've seen from the fallout of COVID-19 and its impact on real estate transactions. Hopefully we're able to give you guys a little bit of useful information that you're able to take away.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate you coming on the show, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, and I've been talking and dealing with some closings as of the last few weeks, is what is your take on the effect that COVID-19 has had on the real estate market and the closings that you've seen so far?
So the primary impact that I've seen is really on the financing side of things. Mm-hmm. So in terms of a seller's obligations, typically everything stays put. When you have a firm agreement, the seller's obligations don't really change. The bank's still able to discharge mortgages. So from that perspective, the seller can complete their obligations under the contract. However, from a buyer's perspective, because banks are now tightening their conditions before financing, it's creating a lot of unforeseen delays in transactions. And sometimes you're encountering cases where there are just delays where the underwriters are reviewing the files and they're adding some conditions that can be fulfilled. But also at the same time, we're seeing some buyers encountering new conditions that they weren't expecting that have now put them in positions where they're not able to close at all.
Are you able to talk about what kind of conditions the banks are putting in that's making it difficult?
Yeah, so for example, because of the change in income at this point, a lot of them are asking for increased down payments. Mm-hmm. A lot of new or prospective investor buyers are now in positions where they have to put upwards of 30% down.
Yeah.
So in these instances, you may not have budgeted for that when you entered into the transaction, and the alternative to institutional lending would be obtaining B-lender financing or private mortgages. And in a lot of these cases, you're encountering interest rates that are upwards of 9-10%, which make closing the deal not the most commercially reasonable approach.
Yeah.
So now buyers are faced with a hard choice of whether or not they should complete the transaction at all.
Yeah. Are you seeing a lot of people resorting to a full mortgage with a B-lender, or they're kind of bridging with like a second position?
So one of the things to keep in mind is, well, to answer your question, there's a mix of both, but in most cases, that's not really a possibility. The reason being is that with institutional lenders, whether they be A lenders being TD, Scotiabank, and B lenders, Home Trust, Street Capital, etc., they have very stringent conditions that they are the only lenders to be in first position. So from a contractual standpoint, you're not technically supposed to have private lending in subsequent positions after the first mortgage. Now, there are, I guess, gray areas that some buyers have tried to use to get around this, but the technical answer is that it's typically not allowed because of the conditions under the first mortgage.
Got it. So then how are a lot of these buyers going about the closing right now?
So a lot of them are frankly, like, they're not in positions to close at all.
Okay.
Our firm's been approached either by clients that we've had closing scheduled for, and then now they're falling through, or we have prospective buyers that have had firm agreements that are coming to us, asking us for advice as to how to mitigate their exposure in the case that they don't close.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing is a lot of buyers really weighing their options, because although there are alternative financing methods that might allow them to close, the interest rates and the carrying costs are too high for them to consider it. So they're exploring the potential risks of not closing and what the fallout might be in that regard.
Yeah. So I think one of the big questions a lot of people have if they're stuck in this situation, and the reason why we're telling this is not to say it's a doomsday prediction for everyone. We're just trying to get the good information out to everyone that may be caught in this particular situation right now. So what kind of exposures or what kind of penalties will happen if, say, a buyer doesn't close on a contract or a deal?
Okay. So I should preface, this is not intended as advice, but this is a number of options that have come up in the course of negotiations on several transactions.
Yeah.
So the most typical relief that a buyer has in most cases, and outside of the context of COVID-19, as I'm sure Zen you're familiar with, is just the mutual release. So in a market where you're facing increasing prices, it's actually favorable for a seller to consider a mutual release, because if from the time a buyer has signed the agreement and typically 2 to 3 months have elapsed on a typical closing, and the market is more favorable, the seller might actually just be willing to terminate the deal, release the deposit back to the buyer.
Correct. Yeah.
And relist the property at the prospect of potentially gaining even more from selling to somebody else. Obviously, this is a unique situation, not just because the market is trending downwards, but we're looking at market confidence to a point where a seller is uncertain if they'll ever be able to sell within the next few months.
Yeah.
You're facing a number of logistical issues. As an agent, you obviously have concerns with listing the property and attending to it.
Yeah, for sure. We can't physically show the property much right now.
Yeah, so that's obviously a concern in itself. And then on top of that, you have such a depressed market because a lot of people have lost their jobs. Cash flow for business owners that might otherwise be using that money to invest in property, that income source is now cut off. You don't have a lot of eager buyers in the market. So even if there is some demand, you're still looking at a bunch of prospective sellers that might just be left in the cold, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think in that regard, the mutual release right now is really the best tool. But from a practical perspective, from what we've seen, the sellers are almost at a loss as to what their best recourse is, because there's so much uncertainty as to the remedies that they might otherwise be entitled to. So from a buyer's perspective, the most perfect situation would be just to get unequivocal mutual release for you to walk away from the deal. The nuance of a mutual release is that you could forfeit the deposit, and that would free up both parties from liability, releasing both sides.
Yeah, kind of like a negotiation, right? Saying, hey, you can keep my deposit that I gave you, whatever, like 5% of the purchase price, and then you are now, no longer, you don't have to close the property anymore.
Exactly. You're also looking at some cases where they release the deposit and the seller might ask for a bump. So an additional 20 or 30,000, for example. And in that situation, they just give a little bit beyond the deposit, and that would entice them to sign the mutual lease.
Yeah.
In speaking with a couple of litigators, though, when you're talking about the worst case scenario, so to speak, is where the seller is unwilling to sign a mutual lease and has threatened litigation.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of these cases that may happen. I know you and I have seen a few of these back in 2017, and it kind of feels like it right now, if anyone who's kind of caught between a hard place right now, right?
Yeah, so for those that are unfamiliar with the, I guess the legal trend or the precedent that has existed in the courts over the years, where a buyer can't close on a deal, if a seller were to relist the property and they
Mm-hmm.
sold at a lower price, the courts have often ruled that the buyer that has breached their contract is now liable for the difference in the
Yeah.
price.
So like, I think you and I haven't counted this enough, but for anyone who's listening, let's just use like actual numbers so people can kind of grasp what we're talking about. So let's just say a seller has sold their property for $500,000, right, to buyer A, but they can't close. But then they uh, terminate, or they don't terminate, I guess they don't release it, but then they relist it and then they only sell it for 400. So are you saying the difference of $100,000 is now the responsibility of buyer A?
Yes. Now it's not a catch-all, but in many cases, that's what we've seen in terms of like judicial decisions. This is a relatively recent phenomenon
Mm-hmm.
that we've seen only kind of develop in the past decade or so
Yeah.
in terms of its prominence. But it is a huge issue, especially in light of the hugely depressed prices that we're going to be seeing in the following months.
Yeah. So in these situations, what do you recommend, say, a buyer would do? Because it seems like the buyers are kind of caught in the most difficult situations right now.
Yeah. So the thing is, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the exposure might be, because some litigators that are a little bit more philosophical have said that, well, maybe the judges will be sympathetic to the buyers
Mm-hmm.
because of this. We're really encountering here is not any kind of recession or anything that we've seen in the past. It's really an unprecedented event.
Yeah.
There are the effects on people's livelihoods and the economy are, we've never encountered anything like this.
Yeah.
So there is the school of thought that maybe the damages will not be as extreme as people are worried about.
Mm-hmm.
And then also there is the practical cost of litigation, whether it be time or money, right? So
Yeah.
a litigation file can take, for you to get a judgment of any kind, can take a year or even more than that sometimes. So depending on what a seller views as because every seller has their own objectives. So if
Mm-hmm.
they get the deposit all tied up and there's a ton of uncertainty in that regard, they might be more willing to attend to a mutual release and tender on that in that regard, instead of trying to sue for the deposit and damages. So I think every situation is unique, but what a prudent buyer should be doing is communicating with the seller,
Mm-hmm.
not right up on the last day saying, "Oh, I can't," my mortgage fell through at the last second,
No,
and
no,
you're not.
we don't want to
No,
do
no,
that.
no. So right now, like, buyers are aware of what's going on. It's not really like a case by case basis in the sense that financing is like a mixed bag for buyers. Like a lot of more buyers are encountering issues than buyers that aren't, right? So
Yeah.
like upfront, it's important to just establish what the seller's goals are
Mm-hmm.
with the property. So if they're selling to buy, then you might have additional exposure if the seller can't close the property they're looking to buy,
Yeah.
that they were relying on your purchase closing, right? So I think that, like, in an ideal situation, to answer your question, that the mutual release is the best tool because it defeats a lot of the uncertainty that you might have.
Yeah.
But again, like having a very well like planned and method of communication with the seller and their agent, so that there's no surprises, because I'm sure you've seen in many instances when you notify a seller at the last minute that the deal is in trouble or
Oh,
something like that.
it
Yeah,
does not go
they're
well.
just
It
not
does
very
not go
cooperative at all.
well.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. They would try to put every penalty possible on the buyer.
Yeah, so I think if you feel as if you're running into issues, notify them early on and try to work something out.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's kind of the best way to approach a lot of things right now, because no one knows kind of like how long this is going to last. And this is all new to everybody and almost every professional. It's just, let's just be nice and try to sort things out so that nobody is in any kind of damages, right? As per the law.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's hard to be a fortune teller in any regard.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, because this is something that we've never seen before, I was speaking to a real estate partner that's been practicing since the mid 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, what his outlook on the market would be and what remedies would be available to either party. And frankly, he wasn't even sure because the implications on buyers, because a lot of these situations are out of anybody's control, right?
Like, yeah. And I think like a lot of it is kind of like no one knows what's going on. And I've been asked a few times, and I know I've spoken to you about it, kind of like there's a lot of people talking about force majeure, which is just a fancy term for saying act of nature, or sorry, act of God, right? Can people within the contracts kind of use that as an escape?
So in a standard OREA form, or like any form for residential properties that a realtor might rely on, it's not structured in there.
Guys, I'm just going to stop Eric there for a sec. In case, or we're talking in like very technical terms, and I know Eric's trying to not say anything wrong from a legal perspective. OREA is the Ontario Real Estate Association, where they have these standard pre-filled forms that if you ever bought a property is what we use to kind of do the paperwork.
Yeah, so just to add on Zen's point, like there are a lot of standard clauses in there that just make an agent's job a little bit easier. Obviously, every deal is structured, on a unique basis. You're going to have certain concerns that a buyer's going to have, and that's why you have a professional like Zen to address those concerns in the schedules to the agreement. Mm-hmm. However, most agents and even lawyers would not turn their mind to an instance such as this. So what we're having is a situation where in nearly all agreements, like in my experience, I've never seen someone add a force majeure clause into a schedule to the agreement.
Yeah.
So broadly speaking, it's not really a method for most buyers to get out of their obligations. Mm-hmm. So a force majeure clause is really used where the parties view the transaction to be impossible to complete. Yeah. And the key word is impossible. So for example, if now you're unable to get financing from a bank, that's not exactly enough for you to escape liability under the contract.
Yeah.
In theory, if you were able to find a private lender, and this is like the sliver, right? It's a test. So if you look at it and say there was an opportunity for you to get financing, however commercially unreasonable it might have been, you could have, technically speaking, fulfilled your obligations under the contract. So strictly from that perspective, you would not be able to escape your obligations. Furthermore, and I'm sure Zen might be able to share some of these resources, which I'll provide later. But in a lot of lawyers' interpretations of what a force majeure clause does is in its wording, it has to be very specific as to what these so-called acts of God are. So, for example, one of the examples is if a fire, right? So if a third party, not as subject to arson, but let's say there's lightning.
Lightning strikes the roof and then fire.
And your building burns down. Obviously, you can't fulfill certain terms, so there's no vacant possession because there's no property, right?
There's no possession at all.
Exactly. So in terms like that, it's very difficult to fulfill, or not even very difficult. It's impossible to fulfill your obligations under the contract. So in those cases, the seller, for example, if it burned down, the seller couldn't close, and that's not really their fault because now you have no property to sell to somebody. Mm-hmm. Now, in most force majeure clauses that might appear in leases and whatnot, you would have to read it very carefully to see if, for example, in this case, pandemic is one of the terminologies that are expressed in the clause. So if it's not, then there's a large likelihood that it'll be unsuccessful. And I would encourage anyone that is considering like to enter into an offer now, before they have their agent and like insert a force majeure clause, speak with your lawyer.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we're talking now, so there's just a couple of things that are going on right now. I'm just going to kind of jump in. There's been a lot of languages that I've seen agents and brokerages put out there for COVID-19, kind of some including like, if third parties such as banks, appraisals, none of those can go, the offer is still conditional on those, or like there's an automatic delay. Like, what are you seeing from a ramification on that perspective for COVID-19? If you're trying to buy something right now?
So I think it really boils down to the reasonableness of the provisions. So we with some of the lawyers at our firm that have been negotiating some of these agreements, if you're looking at terminology that addresses, well, if you're unable to get an appraisal or any of these things, and you extend the transaction by a few days or weeks or however long it gets or however long it takes for the infrastructure to satisfy your financing needs, for example, that is a reasonable provision. What ends up happening is there's a great deal of uncertainty if you have a catch-all force majeure clause that says, well, if I can't get financing, this deal's terminated and both parties walk away.
That's basically just like a permanent conditional until closing then, right?
Yeah. So it depends if like a seller will entertain that, right? And with some of the properties, maybe they're not being, they're not as competitive as they are, as I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah.
Where you have, bully offers and some properties getting 30, 40 offers at a time. I don't know if that'll be happening in this kind of market, but
I don't think so. Yeah.
But so go ahead.
So then what we're saying is if it is permanently conditioned, then if anyone who's selling, your recommendation is talk to a lawyer to see what these provisions mean, right? Because you don't want to basically have a property sold conditionally up until last minute and it gives them the option to kind of back out, right?
Yeah, from a seller's perspective. The thing is to bear in mind is that where some people are trying to put these catch-all clauses is that when the original standard agreement of purchase and sale template that's used by all realtors was prepared, there was a lot of thought that was put into the standard clauses that are in there, right?
Yeah.
Now, for people to now just unilaterally throw in clauses left and right to try and limit their client's exposure, understandably, you need to protect your client, but again, like these are clauses that should pass through a lawyer's desk because there are cases where if a term is too unreasonable, it might not be favorable if it ever comes across a judge, right? So you want to keep these things in mind and then maybe have a lawyer look at it before you proceed with it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the recommendation I've been telling everyone too. Like, it doesn't matter what kind of pre-built clauses you have from like brokerages or your agents. Like in my experience, I would say a good chunk of agents don't actually fully understand some of the language and the clauses in the agreement of purchase and sale.
Yeah.
So if your agent doesn't understand it and you're just willy-nilly signing things, then you could be in a lot of trouble.
Mm.
Yeah.
So we have cases, and this is just from a contractual perspective.
Yeah.
There are sometimes provisions that are so unreasonable that in speaking with the lawyers that do M&A or across the board any kind of transactional work, they've said, oh, we just leave the clause in there because the other lawyer is going to fight about it, but if it ever gets litigated upon on that specific condition, it's going to get thrown out. So they just rather leave it, right? So that's not something the average person would put their mind to, because in their mind is, well, oh, this provision is bulletproof.
Yeah.
In fact, in some cases, it can be too onerous on the other party.
Yeah, and that's where I think not many people understand like what's going on. And again, let's just, rather than kind of leave a lot of people listening out there, just say anything you're doing, I would just recommend having a lawyer review it, like Eric or somebody review it, just because we're in unprecedented times. Yeah, like I saw the other day, and I was actually going to ask you about this earlier, is I saw someone put a condition on a virtual purchase, right? And they said it's conditional upon the buyer entering the property after COVID-19 ends to make sure the property is in good condition. But then it doesn't say when the buyer ends, and basically now you're permanently tied up.
Yeah. So if you're a seller, then you're in a lot of trouble in that regard, right? So I feel like a lot of these clauses that are intended to protect the buyer are great in the sense like you don't want your financing defaulted, and because of that you don't want to lose your deposit and expose yourself to risk. But from a seller's perspective, you want to make sure that condition doesn't effectively bind you to the transaction indefinitely. We don't know how long this lockdown is going to affect us. There's depending on what you're reading, the number of months that this might go on for.
Let's not make any predictions. We have no idea. Like, you can be optimistic or pessimistic about this. Yeah. Okay, Eric. So if that doesn't make sense, let's kind of talk about like penalties. Okay. Say, our listeners are buyers. They can't close or like they need an extension, what kind of penalties are you usually looking for, or sorry, what are the looking to pay if you're trying to extend the closing to kind of get your ducks in order to make sure you can actually close?
So I guess the first thing to consider is just make sure you have an adequate amount of time when you're extending. Now, it's much less of an issue when, you know, a mortgage broker tells you it's just going to be a few days and your deal's kind of just up in the air. But usually, if they tell you it's a few days, it might drag on another day or two beyond that, and everything's fine. But in these exceptional circumstances, we've had, you know, banks, as you've seen with some of your clients, where they're basically giving every indication that they're okay to move forward with the deal. And then really at the 11th hour, they're adding additional conditions that make it untenable. So
it gets very tough.
Yeah. So there is a possibility that you might have to switch lenders like midway through even. So if you're working with one bank and like, well, the first thing is just make sure you have adequate time. So if you're going to negotiate for an extension, you always err on the side of caution. Don't be too optimistic in this, because there are logistical and infrastructural challenges that the banks are facing to satisfy their borrowers and getting money out. And then beyond that, it's also just the bank's underwriting process to make sure their loans are secure. That might take a little longer than.
So are you seeing both of those taking longer, and like appraisals?
It's really on a bank to bank basis, and what I've seen, frankly, is that some days are worse than others.
So unknown.
Yeah, because frankly, like we have a lot of, you know, with the institutional lenders, the A lenders I can speak to, they're generally very consistent. You kind of know how long it's going to take. But so in most days they're on time, but we've seen a couple of cases where, you know, the funding doesn't come until after 2 p.m.
Yeah, so it takes a little bit longer, right?
Yeah.
So basically, advice for people out there is if you need an extension, try to get one. But like, what kind of penalties are they going to be looking at if they can't get it? Like normally that you would see.
So do you mean in terms of like if the contract's terminated, or if
what
the seller would?
Yeah, like what the seller's looking for. Like if, say, the banks come back last minute and say, hey, we can't close yet, we need more time, or like something happens with the mortgage.
Generally, from what we've seen so far, at least, and just bearing in mind, it's only really been a few weeks. I think with everyone stuck inside, it feels like it's been months that have gone by. But we're really just maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks into the extremity that I think most people were still throwing dinner parties the first week of March. But we're really seeing at this point in time our sellers being cooperative.
Okay, that's good.
I've actually had a lot of transactions where reasonable delays within a week or two. They've given them without penalties so far. But outside of that, I can't, at least I don't want to forecast anything, but from what we've seen, everybody's been reasonable. And then the ones that they have charged penalties, it's more so just carrying costs of the property. And, you know, just a very nominal legal fee, if that.
Yeah. So for those who are listening, don't understand what carrying cost is. It's basically whatever the seller's like mortgage, taxes, utilities, or like legal fees. And it's just like calculated all in, right?
Yeah. And now that's not to say like if the situation deteriorates, like you're looking at the first extension, right? So you might get your first extension granted, and then you need another one, because by that time your financing is still up in the air. There's no telling what a seller might do in those instances, because a lot of it is discretionary, right? Because you have a contractual obligation to, you know, satisfy, and they're willing to entertain giving you more time or whatever. But if they decide not to, then that's also up to them. But if they do give you an extension, they might again impose a bunch of penalties, such as if they wanted to add like $2,000 extension fee as a penalty just paid to the seller up front, then they can do that, right? So
because the buyers are kind of at the mercy of the sellers, right?
Yeah,
like if the seller's reasonable, they'll kind of play nice, and it sounds like most people are right now. But if you encounter someone who's unreasonable, they can ask for like the moon and the stars, and it could get really difficult, right?
Yeah. So don't presume anything, and that's why, as we were talking about earlier, just having a communication early on is important in these instances, because you want to have them on your side. You want them to be understanding of what you're going through, and not just telling them at the 11th hour that their deal is blowing up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I can speak from experience too. Like if you know or you sense something is going on right now, then you should definitely let people know, like on the seller side and the seller's agent. Because I know Eric and I have done a lot of deals where we're like, okay, well, the mortgage is going to go sideways. We better notify them to get a little bit more time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, no, for sure. So what happens to say builders, sorry, clients who have pre-construction with builders, and
Mhm.
are you seeing any kind of delays from Tarion, or kind of like first occupancy delays, or even like delays with closing on your side? And I know it's just been like 2-3 weeks, but have you seen any right now?
Yeah, so we've actually had a small handful of delays on interim closing or
Yeah.
occupancy for those who aren't familiar. So an occupancy closing is where you just get the keys, but the title isn't transferred to you at that point,
Yeah.
and
So
that's
this
just
is
from
what
a
people, sorry, to interrupt you,
yeah.
just for people out there. This is that period where most people call phantom rent. You don't own the property yet, but like a lot of the times you have the right to like move in or lease it out.
Yeah. So we have delays from that point, but again, that's not like a really like a legal thing, right? It's just that there are a lot of construction sites are shut down right now,
Yeah.
and with the premier saying that they're going to impose even stricter essential business restrictions, we don't really know what's going to happen with construction. So if you have a deal that's upcoming or a interim closing that's scheduled, there's no telling if in the next few weeks you get a notice that might tell you that it's being put off. Um, from what I've seen, the primary point of concern that some of my our clients are experiencing is where they've already just recently completed their interim closing
Yeah.
and moved in, and now because with Tarion, you set forth a list of all the deficiencies that are in your
Yeah.
property that the
The
builders,
inspection. Yeah.
yeah. So usually they're completed in well, you would hope a relatively reasonable
Timely
amount
manner.
of time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
It
even
never is.
without, no, exactly, and that's the issue, because even without COVID, you're still running into a ton of issues.
Yeah.
But with it, you're in even worse shape. We've had clients come to us and say, "Hey, like, what the hell? Like, how come I'm paying all this money, but
Yeah.
now the construction stopped? I'm not getting access to any of the amenities that they told me I was going to get, such as the gym or the pool that they told me was going to open next month. Now they're saying all construction is halted."
Yeah.
Right. So there are concerns, especially if the deficiencies in your unit or your home, like, they're huge. Like, you have people sometimes there's problems with the shower,
Yeah.
and but these are things that unfortunately, like, there isn't a bunch of leeway in. Like, Terion's relatively rigid in that regard. It
Yeah.
follows its schedule, and until workers really get back on site, it's going to be an issue.
Yeah. So what you're saying, basically the builders would have some kind of provision in there saying, hey, you know what, like because of this unforeseeable delay, like you kind of, as a person living there, you just kind of have to deal with it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess the unfortunate thing is like they're also still paying the phantom rent of like the taxes, insurance, and maintenance that comes along with occupancy.
Yep, yep. And you're not really, there's no real effective recourse that, like, we've seen that's given a lot, like, buyers, like any kind of forgiveness in terms of the occupancy. You have to keep paying them.
Oh, so there's no kind of, the builders are being nice about this.
No, no.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I guess there's really nothing that people can do. It's an unfortunate con of pre-construction, right?
Yeah, like, the thing to keep in mind is that, like, from a builder's perspective, like, they want to pass on the cost as quickly as they can to the buyer. That's the unfortunate
Yes.
reality. So as soon as they get an occupancy permit, which legally allows them to have the buyers move in at that point, they're
Yeah.
in essence free to collect those payments.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there isn't a lot
Exactly.
of leeway in that regard.
I gotcha. So what's happening now with like say pre-construction keys or even like regular closing keys? Like,
So
is there still a weird way of doing it because like people are afraid to touch other things?
So with pre-con, generally speaking, it's still the same process.
Yeah.
Although, like, they're just spreading out the appointments and whatnot, so that in the sales office or the site office there aren't large gatherings of people.
Yeah.
With residential closings, on the other hand, we are seeing a change. So most law offices, so with agents, I'm presuming you guys are relatively mobile. You guys can work on laptops and move around. Like
Yes.
in the legal profession, there are a lot of people that are, like, their law programs and whatnot are static. Like they're just set up on one computer, and they don't have virtual resources. So a lot of firms are now actually not shuttering, but they're just temporarily closed as they try to adjust. The ones that have very quickly moved on to remote access and working from home procedures, because, like, for example, I can only speak from my experience, but our firm, we are not handling keys or closing packages at all. Traditionally with real estate, for anyone who's ever purchased a pre-construction property, for example, you probably had to sign 150 pages of documents.
Yep.
And the typical process is we send everything hard copy to the builder's lawyer. And then on top of that, they always ask for certified checks, and they don't accept direct deposits, wires, or anything like that. But on that end, things have been relatively smooth because they've been accommodating in that regard. Most closings are done electronically now.
Yeah.
So they do accept wires, digital documents. So on that end of things, things have shaken up a little bit, because even to answer your question, with residential deals between a buyer and seller, a lot of the time we just have either the agents coordinate the keys, or we have them left at concierge if it's condo, or they're left at a lockbox, because we just want to minimize the contact between the parties if possible.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I know we've done a couple like that recently too. Yeah. Well, Eric, I know there's a lot of things going on right now and you're busy with a lot of things. I do appreciate your time. Is there anything that you kind of want to add for anyone that's listening out there, kind of like what to watch out for, what to be careful of in amidst this pandemic?
I think like from the transactions that have gone smoothly to date, is really, and this might seem like common sense, but it's really just to not take anything for granted in terms of all the obligations that you have under your agreements. What I mean by that is we typically in normal circumstances see a lot of buyers, for example, just taking their time with financing. For example, they think, oh, if I just go to the bank a week or 2 weeks before my closing, and they'll sort out the mortgage for me. We're living in a very unique time, and things like that, shouldn't be taken for granted. You should always assume the worst case in these situations, because the situation is very fluid. Right now, for example, law firms have seemed to establish a sense of normalcy in how we're conducting business.
That's good.
We don't know if, for example, with additional shutdowns, if there's even less movement, right? And with banks, we don't know. So it's important just to have all your ducks in a row as early as you can. And as we've been discussing, just keep a constant pulse on communicating with the other party, so they know what's going on. And then, because ultimately with any kind of transactional work, typically the goal is for both parties to close. So if you indicate that it's your intention that you want to fulfill your obligations and complete the deal, and you're very forthcoming about it, then it's in their best interest to work with you.
Transparency, right?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes that's not really the case in normal circumstances. A lot of the times, the broker will tell you, oh, just wait, and then the day of closing, tell people you can't close. That's not really going to fly in this, in these conditions. So
so don't take the time for granted. Do everything right away.
And the thing is that you want to make sure, like what I want to expand upon is when you're saying that have everything done right away, is like contact your broker, make sure like all your paperwork with your mortgage is done right up front, and don't delay. Like as soon as you sign the agreement, call your broker, get your insurance in check, retain a lawyer, do all those things. And if you have a lawyer before your deal goes firm to review everything, even better.
Actually, you brought up a good question before I let you go. So if, say, a buyer signed the mortgage documents, once they've signed, can the bank come back and be like, hey, I want you to have 40% down payment?
You can. The thing is, there's a lot of rare instances. So what my typical answer, my answer is no, if you have a commitment signed, because those are the terms, right? But what a lot of the time, what is happening a lot of the time is there are a lot of deals where there's a lot of other competing offers, which won't really be happening now. But
Yes.
sometimes your mortgage broker tells you everything is fine. You don't have a commitment in place. There's no instruction sent to the other lawyer, but you waive your financing condition because you think everything is fine based on the outlook that your mortgage broker has given. So that's something to keep in mind too. Just make sure like you have, something down pat before you waive, if possible. So yeah, I think from that end of things, they can't like come back if there's a commitment and this is the understanding that these are the terms, right? But in some cases where this is more so an issue that we've seen that where everything just turned the corner in the past few weeks, where people didn't really put their mind to thinking that the COVID-19 was going to be this serious.
Yeah.
So their brokers told them everything was fine. They firmed up the deal. Now, because of that and not having signed anything formally with the lender before waiving, that now they're stuck in this like limbo.
Yeah. So for basically anyone out there, like try to get that commitment before you kind of remove your financing condition, because things are fluid, like we've been saying, right? Like it can change very easily and very quickly on you.
Yeah. And then the thing is with you won't really run into this issue with institutional lenders per se, but if you have a B lender or a private lender and they decide to pull their funding, right? You would have like, if they decide, oh, the conditions are bad, I'm going to get out of here. And you could sue them potentially for breaching the terms of the contract in which they're supposed to fund your deal.
Yeah.
Right. But again, like right now we're looking at a situation where the courts are closed. And if you do bring an action against somebody, there's no telling what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think let's not go down that path. I know where it can lead to, like one will sue the other and things won't complete. It's just like a whole chain of things. We won't get there. Yeah. All right, Eric. Well, I appreciate your time. I know you're busy today and shedding some light on kind of what's happening. Is there any way that if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way?
So you can contact me at Eric, that's ERIC, at blackstonelaw.ca. Are you going to be uploading this on YouTube?
Yeah, I will.
Okay, so perfect. So I'll provide you a link and then Zen can share that with you guys.
Yeah. So just go on YouTube. I'll put the links for Eric there. And if you're listening on a podcast, you don't have to stop your car. I'll put it in the show notes as well. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me, Zen. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Eric, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
All right.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Cheers.